In medicine, we have the placebo effect. I almost think that there's a similar version in consumer goods. What we pay for something and what it feels like can impact other sensory experiences. I think that the 180 gram, or I've even seen 200 gram and 220 gram record being better quality is one of the more successful marketing campaigns of the plastics industry. We can make a bad record with a good stamper. We can't make a good record with a bad stamper. And that is very true all the way to the, very start of the chain.
The Fidelity Exchange. Real conversations for people who take listening seriously.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fidelity Exchange. I'm Drew Baird, founder of Moon Audio, and today I'm talking with somebody whose path to where he is now is generally one of the more unlikely stories I've ever come across. A signed musician from England who ended up building one of the most interesting vinyl manufacturing companies in independent music, just down the road in Athens, Georgia. He founded Echo Bass in 2022, a pressing plant built specifically to serve independent artists running on electric closed-loop systems that don't require the boilers and steam infrastructure that most pressing plants have run for decades. He's an early investor into a plant-based vinyl compound called Evo Vinyl, and he sits on the board of Vinyl Record Manufacturers Association. And on top of all that, he still plays bass in an Athens band. Michael Thomas, welcome to the Fidelity Exchange, and really glad to have you here.
Hey, Drew, it's great to be here.
All right, so take me back to the beginning. Where did music come into your life, essentially? How did you get into all of this?
I mean, I think it was really in high school. It certainly wasn't necessarily encouraged through my parents. My grandfather was in a very successful folk band called the Pennine Folk, and he spent a lot of his young adulthood touring the country and putting records out. And I wasn't really certain of the degree of his success, I think, until I was, 14, 15, and I started taking interest in playing the guitar, and he kind of latched onto that. And I think that through the eyes of a 14-year-old, his success, he wasn't a international platinum selling band, but I was fascinated by the fact that you could go and do that. And he encouraged it. My family encouraged it. So I started a band. I think the first name of the band, because it was formed in a local pub, and we looked desperately around the pub for words to call the band. So it was called the Chef Specials. And eventually we came up with the name The Novellos, and I think sometime around the age of 16, 17, we were playing local headline shows and a local independent label, which had been started by a BBC TV producer who was, determined to do this kind of riff on factory records in Manchester. And he signed us. And so that kind of continued from my late teens through my early 20s, being a touring musician. And from there stemmed all of the curiosity that landed me, I think, where I am now.
How did you end up on a label?
I think that the moment that happened, we were actually playing a headline show as the Novellos. And the main support band was a very similar. We were part of a scene, so we were really pulling influence from similar places like the Clash, Dexys Midnight Runners, that kind of thing. We both had brass sections, and a label manager came through after our show. I think actually hit us up on MySpace, which was, that tells you all you need to know about the time that this happened. And he invited us in, and where it was a little bit jarring was, he said he wanted to put a record out on us. I actually have a copy of that here. It's our original 7-inch record that we put out with us wearing red mohair suits.
Love the car.
Yeah. But he actually said, hey, it seems like two members of this band are taking this super seriously. And the band that was supporting us, Silent Call, he said, there's 2 brothers in that band that are taking it super seriously. We think that you should drop the rest and join together. And it felt very cutthroat at the time, but, because these are like our best friends that we've been playing instruments with. But as soon as we started playing live together, it did make a ton of sense, because there was just that desire to see it through, shared by all 4 or 5 of us at that time.
I mean, I think that's more common than you would think. I've heard many stories. I think I watched a documentary on AC/DC, and that sort of happened with that band. Early Led Zeppelin, in terms of some of the original people that started with that. Page was in another thing, and everybody sort of merged together. It's sort of getting together all of the best to sort of form super bands at the time at that point. You know what I mean? But yeah, that seems sort of normal. I think I read that the later that the label had folded. What happened next for you guys?
Yeah, and so and a little about the label is it was very much it was kind of a socialist ideal in a way. I used to play for soccer teams as a kid, and if you played for the soccer team, you paid what we call in England subsidies. Um, and that idea was kind of taken through to the record label. So everyone that was in a band paid a subsidy, and we're not talking like a lot of money. We're talking, $15 a week that went towards the electricity and the rent and all those things. And then a core of the people that were in the bands also worked as the operations of the label. So, the baritone sax player of one of the bands was our booking agent. And then the lead singer of another band was the producer. And so it was very cooperative. The challenge always was that it was always punching above its weight, in terms of, we got a lot of records successfully in the charts, but that guerrilla campaign where you're really leaning on people as a resource and people's enthusiasm, it's very hard to maintain, particularly over years and years and years when you keep saying it's like climbing a mountain and no sooner do you reach the summit, you see the next one. And it felt like that. And I think that the thing lost steam round about the same time the digital music was really sliding into the doldrums of streaming. I remember our record charted because people were able to download it from Juno and these various platforms. So they were paying at least $2 for the single if they weren't buying the record, and that just went. So it was then like, well, how do you monetize a record? And we played a lot of shows and we sold things, but the label just got to a point where it couldn't proceed. And the guy who ran it was really determined that he was going to solve streaming, quote unquote. So he started a kind of a branch off of the label. The label was called Suns, and his streaming platform was very originally titled Sun Stream. And it duked it out with these other platforms, but just didn't really get there. And it left us with this situation where we no longer had control of our rights. Our rights were being absorbed into the streaming platform. So we didn't have the opportunity to release any of our recorded, previously unreleased catalog. We didn't have any control, and it broke the band up. And it just seems so absurd to me to exert that level of control over something to the point where it ends it. But that is how the label ended and how the band ended as well.
Yeah. And so how did vinyl come into the picture?
But I remember as part of this analysis, because as the label was really on the rocks, we had a bit of a all hands meeting about what the landscape is telling us and what we need to do next. And so we pieced together a research team to look into the viability of the streaming company. And I remember all of the data to me said that, streaming's not going to create a huge amount of return for us. And yet, since 1989, there was this consistent trend of vinyl going up. And it wasn't anywhere near as popular then as now, but the trend was very steady. So right after the label ended, I lived in Spain for 3 years. I went in the opposite direction and took a job working in finance. And whilst I was doing that, I started a label to kind of satiate that desire to have continuity working in music in some capacity while I figured things out. And so the label I started was a vinyl only label. We had streaming, but we weren't doing download. It was like you had to buy the thing. So growing up in the north of England, there is this phenomenon called Northern Soul. I'm not sure if you're super familiar with it, but it was a dance hall interpretation of the Motown scene. So record collectors would consume all of the kind of the Motown era work. And then as Motown was moving on in the 70s to more funk-based music, they still desired that very like 4/4 danceable music. And so they started crate digging for stuff that people hadn't heard, one-hit wonders, etc. And the reason it was called Northern Soul was because it was mainly, northern working class football, soccer fans that would go to London, and whilst they were watching a football game, they would go to the record stores in London and look for these rare R&B records, and so it got dubbed Northern Soul by one of the record stores there. It was like this bin of obscurity. Um, for me, I was very curious about who the people were behind those songs, and there was a culture of covering up the names in order to kind of create rarity. And so I started reaching out in the very early stages of Facebook to these recording musicians that were like annotated on the records. And we put together, I actually have, I'm very good at the show and tell here today because I figured these might come up, but these are all 7 inches that we put out on those artists. And the first one was the lady was called Gloria Jones. She was actually a Los Angeles based musician that was the first recorded vocal on the hit Tainted Love. Obviously, lots of artists have had that hit over the years, and she'd never really been credited in any way for her contribution to the melody of it. And so we put her version out of that first, and then we had like 5 or 6 others, and we had some chart success. But then that cemented to me that vinyl was this currency, or at least part of the equation for fans supporting artists through the streaming economy. Through that label, I couldn't get stuff made in less than like 30 to 40 weeks. And as someone who did not have a huge amount of capital, you can't have your capital tied up in product that you can't sell. So I kept upstreaming. I did find a startup in California that was talking about opening a new plant. And this is probably about 11 years ago now, 10 years ago. And I went and worked for them saying, hey, I already have this built in understanding, and I have, records that I need to press. So I became kind of the A&R or salesperson for that record plant. And that really launched me into the space, working for other people for years up until I decided to do it myself in 2022, starting Echobase.
And so, yeah, we've talked about your roots in England, but what brought you to Athens, Georgia?
Really good question. I mean, I guess first, what brought me to the US was whilst working in finance, I still did not know what I wanted to do. I just knew I didn't want to work in finance. And what I liked about the US college system is, you've got liberal arts, you can take a lot of different classes, you can figure things out. And I applied to one college in New York, which was Columbia, and didn't expect to get in. I actually filled out the application whilst visiting. So I hand wrote my application letter. Um, and then I got in. And so I moved to the US, and that was kind of when I applied for the job in California. That took me out there. And then when the pandemic struck, it was a scary place to be in manufacturing, was paying really high rents in California. So I moved back to the UK very briefly, and then was offered a job by a factory in Athens, Georgia. And I thought I was going to be there for a year just as a contractor, helping them to, implement some business management into the plant, and met my wife in Athens, and you couldn't get me to leave. So that's more or less how it happened.
And then, so how did Echo Base start?
Well, during my tenure as a manager for this other facility, it's called Kindercore, the pressing plant that I worked for in Athens. It seemed to me that there was this tension in what was the most rapidly emerging part of the industry was independent artists, and there was no really elegant solution at the time for servicing them. I remember the minimums at the time for a lot of plants were 500 records, 300 records, and that's a pretty overwhelming amount of something to sell when you're just figuring it
Up and
out.
coming,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
So I was questioning that, and also kind of questioning that if you could lower the barrier to entry to people with, let's say, 100 units, if that would then help proliferate demand, as like more people would get into it and then they would repress and things like that. And so that's why I started Echobase. And I think also a curiosity, there was a lot of developments happening in the pressing technology. I mean, the principle of record pressing is still exactly the same, but we use heating and we use cooling, but no one had really revisited how we heat and how we cool. And the cost of energy has always been really challenging in record pressing. You're using gas, you're using electricity in really large amounts. And so looking at this sustainability angle was a big part of it. And it was one of those things where trying to persuade someone else to do it is actually more challenging than,
Starting from scratch.
yeah. So that's what we did. We were very lucky. We had some good anchor clients to open on day one. We were working with Bandcamp on their vinyl program at that time as well. And it just gave us this opportunity to really figure it out. And we developed a great system that worked for us. We were pressing records with just electricity for the first 18 months of Echo Base. And now we actually acquired the pressing plant I used to work at here in Athens. So we still have that system, but now we have a much broader manufacturing base. We have 5 machines. We are using the traditional gas and steam methods, but are now proactively looking at, well, can we apply some of these principles on broader scale? And some of those ideas make sense, but really the reason we were doing it was, can we make it easier to press records with just one machine in a local market rather than relying on super factories? And that might help solve the independent. So we're now much bigger than what we thought we were going to be when we started, but still trying to solve the same problem.
So for people who don't know, why don't you walk us through the process of how a record actually gets made? Where does the process start?
I think I'll begin by saying a lot of people believe the pressing plant is where all this magic happens, but there is a very long tail of things that happen before the record is made. The very first version of a record is cut, and it's cut. Cutting is the reverse of listening to a record. It's using a stylus. It's using a device called a lathe, which has a platter on it, just like a record player does, but it also has a, computer. It's got, magnifying lenses to see up close, and it's actually cutting that record, which is where we get the word cutting, into the surface of a lacquer. And a lacquer is a sheet of aluminum that's been cut into a circle that then has a coating, a lacquer coating. The coating is very similar compound to a nitrocellulose, which we use in film. And I don't know if you watched Inglorious Bastards, but very famously, there's the scene where they set fire to the theater using that film. And actually, a very similar thing happened with the only lacquer manufacturer in the US right around the time of the pandemic, Apollo, and there was a huge fire, just because that it's such a volatile substance. So now the only place that makes those lacquers so that we can cut into them is in Japan. So we cut into that lacquer. The next stage is galvanics or electroplating. So we're going to put that lacquer into a nickel solution, and we're going to run a current through it. And what that will do is it will allow nickel in the solution to apply itself to that original lacquer. So the lacquer is playable, right? You could listen to the lacquer, but what is going to be produced off of it is going to be the inversion of that. It wouldn't be a playable thing. So the very first copy that comes off of it is called the father. And you kind of play this game of back and forth. So from the father, which is not playable, you create a mother, which is playable. And those first 2 copies are just archival. They're really so that you can keep producing stampers. But from the mother is where you make those parts that we work with, the stampers. So again, the mother is playable, the lacquer is playable, the father and the stampers are not. So we receive those stampers at our facility, usually around 3 weeks into a project. And then we're going to do our very first test pressing, which is we put that stamper on the machine. We run the first few records on it, and we're going to send those to the client to say, we did our very best to make the materials that we were provided sound good. We want you to check that the programming's in sequence, that there's not any sounds, clicks and pops or distortion that you're unhappy with before we go and make 100 or thousands, as it may be, of them.
So, how many records can you then make from that lacquer? I mean, how long does it last? Because, the age-old problem with old recordings, right? Tapes deteriorate, and if they've made these lacquers, and if they've made them of a material that could last or test the test of time and survive, why can't these be the best archive tools for, the loss of older tapes? How much can you get out of them? And is there a way to make a permanent lacquer to really, keep in archives for later producing more records?
It's a really interesting question because I think at the very end of, let's say, the first like vinyl wave, we were moving into optical disc CD. And the early technology that was applied to optical disc was then being applied to vinyl, which was, hey, do we need to cut into a lacquer? Could we cut into a harder material? And so at the very end of the first sort of vinyl era, we created direct to metal mastering, which is the same idea. You're cutting into a material, but we were cutting into copper discs. And I think that that is something where those copper discs could be used as a master. But it's a little bit like the Pepsi Coke challenge here is you're cutting into a different material and the verdict remains out there whether it's better, worse. It certainly sounds different. But then vinyl also sounds different from the original tape or from the original master. It has its own characteristics. And of all entities to latch onto this idea of direct to metal being an archival way of preserving something, it's the Church of Scientology. So they bought two of the only direct to metal mastering lathes in the world, and they continue to sit inside the Church of Scientology in Los Angeles. And I have got pretty far in trying to get them to let me use these things, but no dice, no success. But
That's because they got to put it on their spaceships when they go into the.
yes. So I'm informed that L. Ron Hubbard's speeches in their totality are constantly being cut into these discs so that they can be capsuled and buried in the ground. Yeah, in different languages. Yeah, it is pretty wild.
I wanted to talk about, clicks and pops and records. Aside from, static electricity that can cause this on records, you had said something, you had said when you're making the lacquer that sometimes you've got clicks and pops there. Are those just imperfections from the lathe or what's going on there? Is there a way to, it's interesting, because I've bought some the last 10 years, it seems like with the resurgence of vinyl, a lot of companies are trying to get vinyl out the door as fast as possible and try and capitalize on the resurgence and whatnot. And I can't tell you how many records that I've gotten that were bad and I had to, return because I'm like, look, guys, this shouldn't have clicks and pops right out of the gate. I understand after use and wear and tear on it because it's a plastic material that's going to wear around. What causes those from the get-go, and how can you prevent that from happening at the manufacturing process?
It's really difficult. So in Europe, it's much more common for record pressing plants to be vertically integrated. The pressing plant has a cutting engineer and it has plating and it has pressing. And in those environments, you have a pretty tight feedback loop, which is to say, if you're pressing a record and there's a blemish on the stamper, you can very quickly confirm whether it exists on the mother and kind of go upstream from there. In the US, and not just in the US, it's in many markets, but it's a more laterally integrated industry. And so there's lots of lacquer cutters, there's lots of plating facilities and lots of pressing plants. And we do a pretty good job of communicating with each other, but fundamentally it matters how much you care. And I think that goes all the way down to the press operator that's running the machine that day. Just yesterday, we had a test pressing that, the client said, this sounds distorted and we want you to take a listen. And it's that they actually, they said, it sounds like no one listened to this. And I went and spoke, we keep a very good record of the chain of custody with all of this. And I went and spoke to the press tech that ran it. And he actually made 62 test pressings to really dial it in. And I was like, wow, that's pretty unusual. So I then, take a look at the master that they submitted us, and that this level of this distortion is on there. It's a very lo-fi record, and it was actually that the label owner didn't really have a great familiarity with the programming, and so when they were listening to it, they were just like, and they questioned us. But I think what you need is every step of the way is people to question things and say, hey, because it's not just clicks and pops; those are more obvious. Um, but they can emerge on one stamper, right? And going back to your previous point, each stamper can make about 1,000 records. From each lacquer, you can make 10 fathers, which can make 10 mothers, and each mother can make 10 stampers. So you have this multiplier effect. So if you're doing a run of 100,000 records, which, is less common than perhaps it was in the 60s, but certainly your Adeles and are going to do that, that's a huge amount of stampers, which every single one could have a blemish on. And it's how do you implement quality control at that scale? And I think it's difficult. So it's about creating a culture of care within the pressing plant. And then people understanding is that when they find something that they can talk to someone about it and we can trace this chain and see if it's supposed to be there. Also, some people that get records made, they don't care. So we send them a test pressing and they're like, this is fine. Like, okay. So it's a challenge, but I'm with you. I mean, there's there's some records in my collection that I wonder how it left a factory, but it is how it is.
And it's really disappointing when it's something like you've really been looking forward to, and you're like, and then you send it back, you get another one, that one's bad, and it's just like, well, obviously there's something wrong with the original lacquer or something, and it's just like I don't think I'm ever gonna get a good copy of this. But what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about vinyl quality?
I would say, and I think that press implants have maybe created a little bit of this themselves, just with the emergence of lots of new plants over the years. And when someone starts a business, you want it to have that differentiation. It's like we make the best quality records, and that is not to say that the plant isn't tremendously responsible for a good sounding record, but we can make a bad record with a good stamper. We can't make a good record with a bad stamper, and that is very true all the way to the, very start of the chain. So we want to think about your recording source and those files and how the mix relates, and then the master itself. It's not uncommon that someone will submit a master that maybe they just uploaded to their digital DSP distributor, and then they're hoping that we'll put that on vinyl, and we have a pre-flight process specifically for observing these issues and passing them on to the client and saying, "Hey, you actually need a master that is prepared specifically for vinyl." So then that translates into the cut and then into the plating, etc. So I think more and more I try and instill in people that our role, as much as anything, is to be invisible, and the same is true of plating. And really, where a lot of that magic is happening is with your cutting engineer and with the files that either they're receiving or they're creating, or of course, if it's a full analog chain, the how preserved is the tape that you're working from? And there are people now that just specialize in getting the best out of archival tapes, right?
Yeah, we're meeting with some of those people. So let's talk about record weight and plastic material. Most audiophiles sort of say, well, the heavier the record weight, we're going to 100 and 200 grams, are saying, well, they're better because they're heavier. And then, how much does it really come down to the plastic material as well? I hear some people say, again, record weights don't matter. It really comes down to the recording and the lacquers and stuff like that. And then other people I've been reading around cheap materials being used to create the plastics, and how much does that have to do with it? Enlighten us on all of that.
I think that the 180 gram, or I've even seen 200 gram and 220 gram record being better quality is one of the more successful marketing campaigns of the plastics industry. If you conceptualize the sheer detail of a record groove and how shallow it is relative to the material that it's being pressed into, you'll get that kind of grasp of how absurd it is that more, just adding more material, it's not going to give you more depth of grooves or anything like that. It's going to be the same amount of information being um, passed into this material. I think that the difference is tactile. I think it's people holding something that's weightier, and we all know that we can be very affected. I mean, in medicine, we have the placebo effect. I almost think that there's a similar version in consumer goods. What we pay for something and what it feels like can impact other sensory experiences. So no, there is no qualitative difference in the weight. Where I would say that there could be differences is much more at that microscopic level. So what material the pressing plant is using. We have from the very beginning worked with Neotech Vinyl, who are an American-based company that produce compound. They actually import it. It comes in from Thailand. I think probably the vast majority of material does in the US. And they are one of the only companies in the world that has gone and formulated PVC, which is polyvinyl chloride, specifically for how it sounds, right? Beyond that, that doesn't change the fact that people want records of every color. Um, they want them to be opaque. They want them to be clear. They want them to be translucent. And all of these additives that you put into that resin, that raw material, is going to have a different effect. So the worst sounding material that we encounter is the white, the opaque white records, because there's a tremendous amount of pigment that has to go in there to make that record opaque and white. And that pigment is presenting itself at the surface of the groove, obviously. Black, I think, requires not a lot of pigment. Black is really good at consuming other colors, and a lot of the clearer colors tend to sound better as well. Yeah, and it's something that you can really, there's a, the material science of this is something in itself that you can really delve into. But no two compounds are equal, even from the same supplier.
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line about vinyl playback is it all has to do with vibration and resonance and all that stuff. And I would think the only reason I would think a heavier weighted vinyl record might have a little bit of an advantage is maybe because of the larger density of it, right? And may help with resonance and vibrations because, anything you can cut down outside of what you want to pick up of what's going on in the groove, you would think makes a difference. Now, obviously, I haven't done any kind of crazy studies on this, and I don't know if anybody has really on record weight and materials. I always gravitate towards black vinyl because it's the only vinyl you can actually see easily see the gap between the songs, right? If you're ever trying to jump songs on a colored vinyl and you don't have incredible lighting, forget about it. You can't get there. You end up at the end of a song or something like that. So I tend to gravitate towards the black ones, but it's interesting that you say that the clear ones might have some sort of sonic difference to them. But to stay away from a lot, I don't like the ones that have crazy pigments on it because they just make you dizzy staring at the thing spinning around, right? So, yeah, there's probably a whole lot of stuff you could talk about there with materials and density and stuff like that. So how is Evo vinyl different from the Neotech vinyl?
Yeah, so Evolution Music is a startup that came out of the UK, led by a gentleman called Mark Kerry, and he's just incredibly impassioned. He didn't come into the space specifically to address vinyl. He was asking, actually, as a record label manager and a radio station host, he was asking these questions of how, as components of the music industry, can we do things more sustainably? And he and his team were in the process of putting one of their artists out on vinyl. And so they were kind of going, well, the jackets, let's look at that. Are the inks we're using the most appropriate from a sustainability perspective, the paper stock, etc. And then they looked at the material itself. It's no secret that PVC is not, it's certainly not the most sustainable. It's an oil-based material and it can be toxic. When burnt, it releases chlorine, it chlorinates. And so they dug into it and they came to these two materials that seemed like, from a usability perspective, that they could be viable. One was PHA and one was PLA. PLA is arrived at the particular varietal that they use uses a sugar beet crop to create a plastic. So it's literally plant-based. The challenge with that material is that it's basically compostable. It's industrially compostable. Records you do want to be around for a longer time. So they moved on from PLA to a mix of PLA and PHA. PHA is kind of fascinating. You feed a particular kind of microbe a carbon source of varying kinds. It could be a cooking oil. But what it does is it consumes it, and what it becomes is what's used as the plastic. So it sounds absurd, but you harvest these microbes, you shell them, you remove their like exoskeleton or their membrane, whatever it is, and they are the plastic. So the compound they've released is a mixture of those things, and then a few other materials that help it bind and mold, etc., and release from our molds. And very excitingly, Mark feels confident that they've arrived at the commercial version of the product. And I think that maybe this year is the year that we see that running through plants in a commercial capacity. But now they've arrived at the product, of course, you've got to build a supply chain that can endure demand. So I think that's the stage they're at. I'm very proud of what Mark and the team have achieved in the years since we invested very early on. And I just can't wait to see it in the hands of people and to encourage that curiosity. Be very interesting to see how the consumer reacts to it. I think pricing wise, there's going to be parity as well as qualities.
Yeah, I was going to ask. It sounds like a complicated process. If it's going to make records even higher priced. I don't know. It's funny. I don't have a problem paying just about anything for a vinyl record. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to pay like $1,000 or anything like that, but But, there's a whole lot. I don't think a lot of people understand how much goes into making a vinyl pressing versus a CD versus streaming and stuff like that. So you're paying for, more things, a totally different sound, really cool artwork. I mean, it's more about the whole process than anything else when it comes down to vinyl. So, but, so you clearly run a really technical operation. Where do you feel the side of music fits in this for you? Where do you find the most joy in this process?
I mean, it's funny because I feel like as a musician, if you're a technical musician, you have a back like, you have to rehearse your craft, you have to hone your craft. The best jazz players in the world are constantly revisiting something that they do every day and finding new meaning in it, and I think there's something analogous there in the manufacturing. I think it's easy to overplay how much of a role we have in the art, but it's not zero, We're making something that is the artifact, and I think it's not a coincidence that, the vast majority of my staff are participants in as musicians or in as facilitators in the Athens music scene. And I encourage that because it's an extra level of caring. If you're holding a record with another musician's programming, there's a level of empathy there if you two are a musician or someone that enjoys that. So I think it's essential. And with the business that we're in, we're now actively trying to assemble an arts district around the building where people can go and watch music, buy music, listen to music, rehearse music, because I do think it's integral to what we do and preserving it as well.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, let's talk about right now what's going on around Echo Base, not just the factory. I understand, you've got a record store now and yeah, I mean, why don't you dive a little more into all of these other aspects, of what you guys are doing, not just the pressing itself, but the whole sort of ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that the thread that runs through it all is like accessibility. And, originally it was how do we get artists to access the medium at a price that is affordable and sustainable. And that kind of keeps stemming outwards, which is when we were looking for commercial spaces, you know, the commercial real estate is very high to rent to the point where actually like buying it, your payments end up pretty similar in Athens. So when we took on the larger factory, we overstretched ourselves for sure, but as part of the package, we bought the building, and the building's about 30,000 square foot, and we need about half of that to produce vinyl records in. So we've been activating the remaining space to try and bring our community into what we do more and more. So there's always been a band practice rehearsal space there, almost as like a value add for staff. But now that space is more multifaceted, multifunctional. It's used as a dance studio. It's used as a rehearsal for a comedy troupe, a burlesque club, and all these things. It's awesome. And my wife moved her hair salon in there. We've got the local record store that's expanding and moved in there. We've got a coffee shop. We've got a fine furniture maker and more recently a magazine called The Bitter Southerner. They're a publication that's really highlighting, I think, culture and music and art in the Southeast. And so
Very cool. Very cool.
yeah, it just feels like it's amplifying everything that we do, which is wonderful and makes staffing easier. It makes selling easier. It's a very circular economy, that's for sure.
The only thing you need left in there is a, tattoo parlor.
For sure. I think that would be a problem for me. I mean, I'm pretty tattooed. I would have
Oh,
been
yeah.
getting high on my own supply. Yeah, it would be a problem.
So what do you think's actually driving the vinyl revival these days?
I've tried to answer that for the whole time I've been in it, and it's actually really reassuring that there are so many answers to that because that tells me that there's not one thing that could or would topple it. And I think that collector culture in certain genres are what sustained it in those weaker years. That's still there. People want to collect. People want to collect something, almost like a baseball card. They want to collect something. I've got a 16-year-old daughter. I wouldn't say she collects, but she likes owning it. She likes buying it. She likes that level of connection to the artist beyond going to the show. I think part of it is that CD was always the convenient format, and convenience has really been driven to the point where we hold our entire library in our hand, or we don't even need to anymore, but we take it with us. And so, what is the collector's format? What's the format that we share in social spaces? And I think vinyl just has the edge on CD there, but I don't know if you've seen the statistics, but CD isn't going anywhere either. It's declined for sure. But I joke that it's like up until this year. Actually, nice. I mean, my Ford F-150 still has a CD player, and I still have a stack of CDs in there. I think maybe when those cars age out, we'll see less of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned this in other videos before. I think kids are seeing vinyl as nostalgic and retro and hip and trying to get back into this is where Dad came from. This is where he originated from vinyl because I was a huge vinyl collector and a DJ back in the 80s and 90s. And then from a CD aspect, in one of our videos we did where we did a record store day video with a local record shop, they've seen record sales double in the last year. And I'm like, who's buying all these CDs? And it's all the young kids are buying used CDs. Why? Because they're getting all these clunker cars that have CD players in it, right? None of the new cars have CD players, but they've got CD players in there. Sort of like when I was a kid, I had, or well, older than when I was a kid, but some of my first cheap cars, they had tape decks in it, and all I had were CDs, so I had to use a portable CD player to plug in that tape, adapter into the tape deck so I could hear my CDs in the car. So I think that's part of it. And yeah, once cars go away with CD players, I don't know what we're gonna do at that point. We're gonna have to put turntables on the steering wheels so that they can play their vinyl in the cars.
There's a great picture. I think it's Muhammad Ali. It's a picture of him, some kind of press photo in his
Yeah, it's a Cadillac,
convertible.
if I remember right, with a turntable in the Cadillac.
Yeah, a little 7-inch turntable. And actually, what I wanted to show you is I just went to a conference last week. It's called Making Vinyl, and it's our annual sort of get together. But I just saw these for the first time. I don't know if you see the tiny vinyl.
Oh, wow, I've
Um,
never seen that before.
I haven't decided how I feel about it yet,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
think anything that gets people to engage with the medium isn't a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is playable. It's small. I think if I compare it to a 7-inch record here, there's a 7-inch. And that's it side by side. And it's playable, but it plays one song. And if I joked at the conference, I was like, "Oh, so we've got a smaller medium that plays just one song." We haven't we always had that with a 7-inch record? But I think this is a way for these big box stores to sensationalize the medium, and if it's engaging people, and I'm all for it.
It's probably also, it's a lot less to produce that one single and great for bands at shows to just pass out some free music just to get people engaged into that band, and then potentially they go buy the full vinyl or something. I mean, it's a great gimmick. I think it's pretty cool. So last thing, music. What are you listening to right now, and what have you pressed recently that you'd want people to go find out about?
If anyone should be against streaming, I think it should be me. Like the label I was signed to got killed by streaming, but I run a vinyl record facility, but I'm massively into streaming. For me, it is the discovery side of things. And just this week, I got switched on to this guy called Mason Jennings, and I think his first record came out in like the early 90s. And he's got this kind of it's a trio. I think he's playing like an acoustic, maybe the nylon string, but he's got a drummer and a bass player, and it's poetry. It's poetry with rhythm and feel and melody, and he's great. Um, my go-to is always going to be that like great era of R&B, the 60s, and just digging into either Philly soul or Detroit soul. Like that's a happy place for me. But in terms of what we've pressed lately, I mean, country music it's not the country music that I thought when I moved to the US, and it's just coming through in droves. We just worked on a few records recently from really young songwriters that are having a lot of success here in the Southeast. And Waylon Wyatt is one that we just pressed, and he came to the Georgia Theater, and I got to take my daughter to see him. And that was kind of a great full circle experience for me watching someone. He's not an established artist by any means, but we're making his record and he's playing a sold out show, and she gets to hear him for the first time and enjoy that. So I'm feeling pretty good about the state of music, considering that there's so much doom and gloom about AI slop and all that kind of stuff.
So funny that you mentioned the Clash at the beginning. So I brought Joe Strummer, and this is an album that I got at Record Store Day that I've been trying to find on the used market for a long time, because Global A Go Go is like one of my all-time favorite songs by him. So when this came out at Record Store Day, oh my God, I was so excited to get this, because I've got the digital copy, but I wanted vinyl so bad. And it's so hard to find this. I've been to so many audio shows, and every, vinyl collector that's there selling records, I'm like, can you get this for me? Can you get this for me? So when this came out, I was super psyched, and it didn't disappoint. The recording and the pressing and everything about it is fantastic. So, um, well, Michael, this is absolutely fantastic conversation. A lot of really fascinating technical information that I don't think a whole lot of people know about. We'll make sure to put a bunch of information and links in the description about your pressing company, and any other information you have on the record store and stuff like that.
Excellent, thank you. And if there's one thing I would encourage to your audience is look up where your nearest record pressing plant is, because I think that seeing it and experiencing what it is to make a record is it still blows my mind every time I go to work. So go and see if they'll give a tour. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit. It's been a pleasure.
And for everyone watching, links to Echo Base and everything Michael is building in Athens are in the description below. If you've ever wondered what actually goes into making a record, I hope this gave you a whole new appreciation for it. Please make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's coming. We've got a lot more of these conversations in the pipeline. Michael, thanks again, and we'll see you next time on the Fidelity Exchange.